There is a quality of stillness that belongs to the edge of large water, not the stillness of a closed room or the quiet of a house when everyone has gone to sleep. This is a wider stillness, the kind that opens outward in every direction, that takes the sounds of the world and spreads them thin over a great expanse of sky and surface. The sound of wind moving across water, the sound of the water itself, slow and rhythmic against the shore, the vast and patient sound of something that has been here much longer than any of the people now standing beside it. This is a peaceful story from the ancient scriptures, set aside for the quiet hours of night. Let it hold you gently as you rest. The people of Israel were camped at the edge of the water. They had come a distance from Egypt, not a great distance by any modern measure, but enough distance to feel the change. The land of Goshen, where they had lived for so many generations, was behind them. The familiar outlines of their Egyptian world, the river, the delta, the great monuments on the horizon, were no longer visible. They were somewhere new and somewhere difficult, because in front of them was water, a wide body of water, the arm of the sea that the ancient world knew by different names, the Sea of Reeds or the Red Sea, depending on the tradition and the translation. Wide enough that the far shore, if there was a far shore, could not be seen clearly. Deep enough that crossing it on foot was not possible. And behind them, somewhere in the landscape they had just left, was Pharaoh. The people had made camp at a place the ancient account calls Pi Hahiroth, near a place called Ba-ol-Zephon, beside the sea. These names are old, and their exact locations have been a matter of quiet study for many generations of scholars. But what matters in the story is not the precise geography. What matters is the quality of the situation. They were between, water ahead, the Egyptian army approaching from behind, desert on the sides. There was no obvious way forward and no way back that was safe, and the people who had walked so purposefully out of Egypt were now standing at the edge of water in the dark and asking themselves what exactly was going to happen next. This place had not been chosen at random. The ancient account is careful to tell us that God had directed Moses to bring the people to this specific location, this narrow place between the water and the open desert, this spot that would have looked, to any outside observer, like a strategic mistake. The people were enclosed, hemmed in, with the sea in front of them and no clear path. And the instruction was, camp here. There's something worth resting beside in this. The place that looked like a trap was the place that had been chosen. The location that appeared to offer no way forward was precisely the location where the way forward would be made. Not by the people's own effort or ingenuity, but by something else entirely. The ancient text gives a reason for this arrangement. It says that Pharaoh would see the people in this position and conclude that they were confused, that they had wandered into a corner, that they were easy to recapture. And in thinking this, Pharaoh would pursue them, and in pursuing them, he would bring his army to the edge of the same water, and there, at the edge of the water, something would happen that would change everything. The apparent trap was not a trap at all. It was a setting, a stage prepared for something that had not yet occurred. But the people did not know this yet. They only knew the water was in front of them, and they had been told to stop here and wait. Waiting at the edge of something large and unknown is one of the more difficult human experiences. It asks everything of us that we find hardest: the suspension of our need to act, to solve, to move, the willingness to stand still while the situation remains unresolved. The people of Israel had been doing a great deal of waiting across a great many years. They knew something about it. This did not necessarily make it easier, but they had learned, perhaps, that waiting is not the same as nothing happening. That stillness is not the same as abandonment. They camped. The water moved in front of them. The night came. Meanwhile, in Egypt, something had shifted. Pharaoh had sent the people of Israel away. He had done this in the night, in the urgency of that overwhelming darkness, when he had called for Moses and said, "Go, take everything, leave, go." He had meant it in that moment, or meant it as much as he was capable of meaning anything in the midst of such a night. But the night had passed, the morning had come, and with the morning came the return of ordinary thought, ordinary calculation, ordinary power. Pharaoh began to reconsider. The ancient text says that he and his officials asked one another, "What have we done? We have let the Israelites go. We have released our labor. We have sent away the people who have been building our cities and working our fields and making the machinery of Egyptian life function. They are gone. And now what?" This is the kind of reconsideration that comes with the daylight, the reassertion of the practical mind after a night of something larger than practicality, the return of the accountant's eye after the departure of whatever deeper awareness had moved through Egypt in the darkness. Pharaoh prepared his chariots. He gathered his army. The ancient account describes the force in vivid terms: 600 of the elite chariot corps, and all the other chariots of Egypt, and horsemen and soldiers. The full force of what Egypt could bring to bear on a retreating group of former slaves on foot. He set out in pursuit. The Egyptian military in this period was a formidable thing. The chariot corps in particular was the high technology of its era, fast, mobile, capable of covering ground at a pace that no infantry could match. A chariot drawn by well-trained horses could travel many times faster than a person on foot. The people of Israel were traveling at the pace of their slowest members. The children, the elderly, the animals, the pregnant women, the sick. They had been walking for days. They were carrying everything they owned. They were not fast. The chariots would have gained on them steadily. The math of the situation was not complicated. Pharaoh and his army drew nearer, and the people of Israel, camped at the edge of the sea, saw them coming. When the people looked up and saw the Egyptian army approaching, the chariots, the horses, the soldiers in the distance, they were afraid. The ancient text says this plainly, without embellishment. They were very afraid. This is honest. This is human. Whatever the people had experienced in Egypt, whatever the signs and wonders they had witnessed, whatever confidence had carried them through the preparation and the departure and the first days of walking, in this moment, with the army behind them and the sea before them, the fear came. They cried out, and in their crying out they turned to Moses with words that carried the sharp edge of desperation. They said, "Was there no room to bury us in Egypt? Did you bring us here to die in the wilderness? Is this what we left Egypt for? There is something very recognizable in this. The turn from trust to fear when circumstances become genuinely dangerous. The sudden re-evaluation of a decision that had seemed right, when the difficulty of it becomes undeniable. The voice that says, perhaps we were wrong to leave. Perhaps the familiar difficulty was better than this unknown one. The people had been slaves. Slavery was suffering and diminishment, and everything that freedom was not. But it was also familiar, and familiarity has its own pull, even when what is familiar is harmful. They were afraid, and in their fear they spoke. Moses answered them. His words, as the ancient account records them, were calm, not dismissive of the fear. He did not pretend the army was not coming, or that the sea was not there, or that the situation was not genuinely dangerous, but calm. He said, do not be afraid. Stand firm. Watch. The God who brought you out of Egypt will fight for you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. And then he said something that has stayed in the memory of this story across all the centuries since. He said, the Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Be still. In the face of the chariots, in the face of the sea, in the face of everything that looked like impossibility and felt like the end. Be still. After Moses had spoken to the people, the ancient account records something that catches the attention in its gentleness. God spoke to Moses and said, why are you crying out to me? It is a surprising line, not harsh. Nothing in the account treats Moses harshly, but it carries something in it, a kind of tenderness mixed with redirecting energy, as if to say, the time for crying out has passed. The time for something else has come. Tell the people to move, and then lift your staff, stretch your hand over the sea, and I will divide it, and the people of Israel will walk through the sea on dry ground. These words were given in the quiet, in the space between the fear of the people and whatever was about to happen, in the moment that existed between the desperate and the miraculous, a moment that in all the noise and confusion of the situation was, at its center, very still. Moses had a staff, the same staff he had carried in the wilderness as a shepherd, the same one he had carried in the courts of Pharaoh, the same one that had been with him through all of this. A shepherd's staff, a plain and ordinary object in the hand of a man who had learned, over many decades, to trust that plain and ordinary objects and plain and ordinary people could be instruments of something beyond themselves. He held the staff. He waited for the moment. Before any water moved, something else moved. The ancient account tells us that the pillar of cloud, the presence that had been going before the people, leading them, showing them the way, moved. It had been in front of them throughout the journey. Now it came around behind them. It positioned itself between the camp of Israel and the approaching Egyptian army. It stood there, the ancient text says, bringing darkness to one side and light to the other. The Egyptian side was in darkness. The Israelite side had light. The two camps spent the night separated by this presence that had simply changed its position, that had moved from going before the people to standing between the people and what threatened them. The Egyptians could not advance through the night. The two camps remained separate. the sea still and quiet between them and the pillar between them and the Egyptians, and the night passed. Let the mind rest on this image for a moment. The pillar that led them had become the pillar that shielded them. The same presence, the same fire, the same cloud, but repositioned, turned from a guide into a guardian at the very moment when guidance was less necessary than protection. There is something deeply settling in this, the sense that the same care that leads us through ordinary days does not disappear when the days become extraordinary. It simply does a different thing that the different moment requires. It moves, it adjusts, it stands between the threatened and the threatening in the particular darkness of a particular night and holds the space until morning. The Egyptians camped in darkness. The Israelites camped in light. The water was still. The night deepened. And then, at some point in the hours of darkness, the ancient text does not specify the exact hour, only that it was during the night, Moses stretched his hand over the sea. A wind came. The ancient account describes it as a strong east wind, the kind of wind that the people of this region would have known, the kind that comes off the desert and moves with steady, driving force across the open landscape. Not a gentle breeze, a purposeful wind. It blew all through the night, and as it blew, the water moved. The sea was divided. The waters were pushed back, gathered to one side and to the other, and in the space between them the ground was exposed. Not muddy ground, not treacherous ground. The ancient text says the ground was dry, firm underfoot, a path through the middle of the sea, with the water standing on either side. This is the central image of the crossing, one of the most enduring images in all of the ancient scriptures. The water standing up, the dry path through the middle, the people walking through on ground that had been, moments before, the floor of the sea. The wind blew all night. The path remained open, and the people walked. The particulars of what the wind was doing, how the water stood, what the crossing looked like in its physical reality. These have been the subject of much careful thought across many generations, and different people have understood them in different ways. The ancient text itself does not labor over the mechanics. It simply says, the wind came, the water divided, the ground was dry, the people went through. What the text does labor over is the accompanying sense of presence, the awareness woven throughout the account that what was happening was not simply a meteorological event, however extraordinary. It was a deliverance. The sea was not simply parting because of wind. The sea was parting because the one who made the sea had something specific in mind for this particular night, for this particular people, on this particular shore. The wind and the water were instruments, the way Moses' staff was an instrument. Behind them was something the instruments themselves could not contain. The people of Israel walked into the sea. This is an act that requires a particular kind of courage to even imagine. Not the loud, charged courage of a warrior charging into battle, but a quieter courage. The courage of a person who looks at something that should not be possible and takes the first step toward it anyway, because the instruction was given and the ground is there and the only direction is forward. The water stood on either side. The ancient account describes it as a wall, the waters as walls on their right hand and on their left. This is the language of protection as much as wonder. A corridor through the impossible, with the sea itself becoming the boundary that held the path open. The people walked through. Imagine the sound of this, if you can do so gently. The sound of many thousands of feet on ground that had been the floor of the sea. The ground would have been different from road or desert. Perhaps smoother, perhaps marked with the particular texture of a seabed. Damp, possibly, even if dry enough to walk on, and perhaps still carrying the faint smell of salt and deep water. The animals went through with them, the flocks and herds, the donkeys loaded with the things the people carried, the livestock that had been the wealth of their Egyptian years. Animals moving through an impossible corridor, guided by the people who had tended them across many generations. The children went through, the elderly went through, the ones who could move quickly and the ones who could not, the strong and the weary, all of them, walking through the middle of a divided sea, with the water standing on both sides and the dry ground under their feet. It was night. The crossing happened in the darkness under the stars, with the east wind still blowing and the water holding its position on either side of the path. The people would have been moving by whatever light was available. The stars, perhaps the distant glow of the pillar that stood between them and the Egyptian camp. There is something about a night crossing that belongs particularly to this story. The Exodus itself had begun at night, the night of watching, the night of departure, the night of the first camp at Succoth. And now this night, the night of the crossing. Important things happen in the night in these ancient accounts. The darkness is not simply the absence of light. It is a time of its own, a time when things that cannot happen in the ordinary business of day become possible. The people crossed in the night, and the night held them. At some point during the night, the Egyptians began to move. The ancient account says that toward the morning watch, the last of the 3 periods into which the night was divided in the ancient world, the watch that belongs to the hours just before dawn, God looked down at the Egyptian army from within the pillar of cloud and fire, and the Egyptian army began to experience difficulty. The ancient text describes it in terms of confusion and obstruction. Wheels of chariots becoming difficult, the chariots moving badly, the army losing the quality of order and forward motion that made it such a formidable force. Something was not working the way it should work. The Egyptians said to one another, "Let us retreat. Let us get away from Israel. Their God is fighting against us on their behalf." There is a recognition in this, brief and perhaps too late, but present. The Egyptian soldiers could feel it. This was not an ordinary pursuit. The force arrayed against them was not only the former slaves walking through the sea. Something larger was at work. They tried to turn. They tried to retreat. And Moses stretched his hand over the sea. It was morning now, or approaching morning. The darkness beginning to release its hold on the sky. The first grey light of pre-dawn beginning to appear. Moses stretched his hand over the water, and the water returned. It came back. The wind changed or calmed, and the sea returned to its full depth, returned to what it had been before the night, and the wind and the path had altered it. It returned over the chariots, over the horsemen, over the army that had been in pursuit. The ancient text says the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen, all of the army of Pharaoh that had followed the people into the sea. Not one of them remained. The sea settled. The morning came, as it always comes. Gradually, first the lessening of dark, then the appearance of the horizon, then the slow and steady brightening of the sky until the sun is fully risen and the day is plainly what it is. The people of Israel stood on the far shore. Behind them was the sea, quiet, vast, deep and still, returned to itself as though nothing had passed through it. Ahead of them was the wilderness, the Sinai, the long road, the many years of journeying still to come. They had crossed. It is worth pausing here, in the gentleness of this hour, and letting the mind simply rest in the image of the far shore. The people had crossed the sea. They had walked through something that should not have been walkable. They had moved from one side of an impassable barrier to the other, in the dark, in the night, with the wind blowing and the water standing on either side and the ground firm under their feet. And now they were on the other side. The far shore is a particular kind of place in the geography of the spirit. It is the place you did not know you would reach when you were standing on the near shore looking at the water. It is the place that became possible only after you began walking toward it. It is the place that, once you stand in it, makes the near shore look different, makes the fear that held you there seem more understandable and also more distant. The people stood on the far shore in the morning light. They had left Egypt. They had crossed the sea. The army that had been in pursuit was no longer in pursuit. They were free in a different way than they had been free the night they left Egypt. Leaving Egypt had been freedom from, but standing on the far shore with the sea between them and Pharaoh was freedom in a more complete sense. The pursuit was finished. The path behind them was closed. The only direction was forward. The ancient account says that when the people saw what had happened, saw the great work that God had done, saw the sea lying quiet and still, saw the evidence of the night's deliverance, they believed. And they sang. The singing that follows in the ancient text is one of the oldest poems in the biblical record, a song of praise and wonder that tradition attributes to Moses and to Miriam, his sister, who took up her tambourine and led the women in the refrain. The song spills over with the particular feeling of people who have just experienced something they cannot fully comprehend. Gratitude, awe, the slightly dazed quality of those who have been through something extraordinary and are only beginning to understand what it was. But the song is for another day and perhaps another night. Tonight, we rest in the stillness before the song, in the quiet moment when the people stood on the far shore in the early morning with the sea behind them and the wilderness ahead, and the slow understanding beginning to arrive. They had crossed. Water appears at many of the significant moments in the ancient scriptures, and it is worth resting beside this for a moment in the quiet way of a bedtime story. Not as a lesson, but simply as something to notice. At the beginning of the world, in the very first verses of the ancient account of creation, there is water, the deep, the formless expanse, over which the Spirit of God moved before anything else was made. Water is the origin. It is present before light, before land, before any living thing. In the story of Noah, Water covered the earth and then receded, and what was left behind was a world that could begin again. In the life of Moses himself, water had appeared at the very beginning. He had been placed as an infant in a basket on the Nile, set adrift on the river, and found there by Pharaoh's daughter. His very name, the ancient text suggests, is connected to the word for drawing out of water. And now, at this great moment in the life of the people he was leading, water again, the sea that divided and became a path and then returned. Water, in the ancient imagination, was the boundary between the ordered world and what lay beyond it. To pass through water was to pass through a kind of threshold, to move from one state to another, to cross from one kind of life into a different kind of life. The people who walked through the sea walked through such a threshold. They were, in some deep sense, the ancient writers understood, different people on the far shore than they had been on the near shore. Everything that had pursued them was now gone. This is a remarkable thing to sit with quietly in the peaceful hours of the night. The chariots were gone. The horsemen were gone. The military power of Egypt, which had been the mechanism of their captivity, which had been the enforcement of all those years of labor, which had represented the force that kept them in their place and made their freedom impossible. All of it was gone. Not defeated in battle, the people of Israel had not fought. They had walked. They had simply walked in the night through the divided sea, and the thing that had been pursuing them had been overtaken by the returning water. Moses had said, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." And it had been so. The people had not raised weapons. They had not organized a military defense. They had done the things they were told to do. They had moved when they were told to move. They had walked through when the path was open. They had stood on the far shore and watched the sea return. And the army was gone. This is not the normal shape of deliverance by any ordinary human standard. Normally, freedom must be fought for in ways that involve the agency and the strength and the sacrifice of the people seeking it. The story of the Red Sea crossing is notable precisely because it is so different from this, because the people were asked simply to move forward, and the battle was not theirs to fight. What was also left behind, in a quieter way, was a particular kind of fear. Not all fear, of course. The people would be afraid again, many times, in the long years of wilderness journeying ahead. Fear is not so easily left behind, but the fear of Pharaoh, the fear of Egypt, the fear of the specific force that had held them, this was left behind on the far shore, dissolved into the water that had returned over the army. They had seen, with their own eyes, that the power they had feared was not the largest power in their world. This is a difficult thing to carry as a truth, and an easy thing to lose hold of in difficult days. But on this morning, on this shore, they had seen it. They had walked through the divided sea, and they were alive. The army was gone, and the sea was quiet. The morning light was on the water. The water was still. The sky above was the wide and cloudless sky of the desert, beginning to take on the particular blue of a clear morning in that part of the world. Deep, clarifying, immense. They turned from the water and faced the road. The Sinai Peninsula, which stretched before them, is a triangular piece of land between the two arms of the Red Sea, arid and rocky and remarkable in its own spare way. The land rises toward the south into dramatic mountain country, the kind of peaks that change color through the day as the light changes. The northern part is lower, sandier, windier, the landscape of a transit zone, a place people pass through rather than settle in. The people were entering this landscape with no map, and no particular experience of it, and no certainty about how long they would be in it. Moses had told them they were going to a land of promise, the land that had been given to their ancestors in the covenant made with Abraham. But the land was not just over the next hill. It was on the other side of a journey whose full length none of them yet knew. They knew they needed water. They knew they needed food. They knew they needed rest, real rest, the kind that a people needs after years of labor and months of upheaval and the long, extraordinary night they had just lived through. The wilderness ahead of them was not an easy answer to any of these needs. It was, in the way of wilderness places, indifferent. It did not offer or withhold particularly. It simply was what it was. Stone and sky, and the occasional scrub of thorny plants, and the tracks of animals that knew how to live in such a place. But the pillar was still with them. The one who had brought them through the sea had not departed when they reached the far shore. The guidance that had led them to this point had not ended when the immediate crisis had passed. The same presence that had divided the water would provide for them in the wilderness, not always in ways that were comfortable or expected or immediately satisfying, but provide nonetheless. They picked up their things, they gathered their animals, they began to walk. There is a phrase that appears in the writings of the later prophets of Israel, people who wrote long after the Exodus, who had grown up hearing this story, who carried it in their bones the way all of Israel's history was carried, and who drew on it when they needed language for something too large for ordinary words. One of them wrote in a later century about the God who made a way through the sea, a path through the mighty waters. The phrase is simple: way through the sea, path through the mighty waters. It says what it says without elaboration, because by the time this writer used the phrase, it was already so deeply embedded in the memory of the people that it needed no explanation. Everyone who heard it knew exactly what was being invoked. A way through the sea, a path through what had looked impossible. This became, in the vocabulary of Israel's faith, a kind of shorthand for a larger trust. The trust that the one who had made a way through the sea was capable of making a way through whatever else lay ahead. That impassability was not the same as impossibility, that what looked like a closed door or a dead end or a wall of water might have within it a path that had not yet become visible. The people carried this memory into the wilderness. They would need it many times. The story of the Red Sea crossing is not a story about the absence of difficulty. It is, in many ways, a story about difficulty, about the fear that came when the army appeared, about the desperation in the voices of the people when they cried out, about the real, genuine danger of the situation. But it is also a story about what happened inside the difficulty, about the pillar that moved from front to back, from guide to guardian, about the wind that came and blew all night, about the path that opened in what had been impassable, about the morning and the far shore, and the quiet sea, and the people standing in the early light with everything still ahead of them. Difficulty and deliverance are not opposites in this story. They are the same story, told in sequence. The difficulty came first, the deliverance came after, and those who had lived through both were changed by both. Let us come back now to the shore. The morning is fully arrived. The sun is rising, or has risen, its light lying golden and flat across the surface of the water and the desert ground on either side. The sea is quiet, fully itself again, the surface moving with its own slow rhythms, unhurried, indifferent to what has just occurred above its depths. The people are resting. After the night of walking, after the crossing, after the standing and watching and the long compression of fear and wonder, they rest. The bodies that have carried them through all of this require it. The animals have found whatever grass or scrub they can find. The children are sleeping, perhaps, in the arms of their parents, or simply in the shade of whatever shelter has been arranged. The quiet is immense, the kind of quiet that follows something enormous, not the ordinary quiet of a peaceful morning, but the specific quiet of aftermath. The silence that comes when something that was very loud has simply stopped. The silence of a shore after a storm. The silence of a morning after a night of crossing. In this quiet, the people breathe. It is enough for the moment just to breathe. They do not need to understand everything that has happened. They do not need to resolve all of the questions that will arise in the days ahead. The questions about water and food, about direction and the length of the journey. These questions are real and they will come, but they do not need to be answered in this particular moment. In this particular moment, there is only the shore and the sea and the morning and the breathing. The people breathe in, they breathe out. The sea moves in its own rhythm, steady and slow, against the shore beside the place they have stopped. Somewhere, the day is beginning in Egypt. The ordinary life of that country is continuing in whatever way it continues after an enormous night. But that is very far away now, on the other side of the water. Here, there is only the morning, the breathing, and the slow return of ordinary sensation to people who have been through something extraordinary. The words Moses spoke to the people in their fear at the shore are worth returning to in the quietness of this hour. Do not be afraid. Stand firm. Be still. Watch. These are not words that pretend the situation is not difficult. The army was real. The water was real. The fear was real. Moses did not say, "There is nothing to worry about." He said, in the face of the real thing that is happening, do not be afraid. Stand firm. Be still. There is a distinction between these two things, between the dismissal of fear and the instruction to be still despite it. The dismissal says, your fear is unfounded. The instruction says, your fear may be entirely understandable, and nevertheless, be still. Watch. Let the one who brought you here do what the one who brought you here is capable of doing. This instruction, be still, is not passivity. It is a very particular kind of action. It requires something of the people who receive it. It asks them to hold their ground, to resist the impulse toward panic or retreat, to keep their eyes open and their feet planted and their trust oriented towards something other than what the immediate situation suggests. The people had been afraid. They had cried out. Moses had told them to be still, and then the wind had come, and the water had moved, and the path had opened. Being still in the story was not the end of the story. It was the preparation for the next thing. The stillness was what made it possible to see the path when it appeared, to recognize it as a path, rather than missing it in the noise and confusion of fear. If the people had tried to scatter into the desert in their fear, they would not have been at the shore when the water divided. If they had tried to fight the Egyptian army with whatever they had, which was very little, they would not have been in a position to walk through when the moment came. The stillness was not nothing. The stillness was exactly what the moment required. And then, when the moment for movement came, they moved. This is its own kind of wisdom, a wisdom that does not belong to any particular culture or tradition, but that this particular story embodies in a way that has stayed in the world's memory for a very long time. There is a time for stillness. There is a time for movement. Knowing which is which and trusting the difference is one of the harder things the human life asks of us. The people of Israel would walk in the wilderness for 40 years. This fact is well known, and it belongs to a much longer telling than this story can hold. The 40 years contained everything a life can contain: birth and death, celebration and grief, faithfulness and failure, miracles and complaints, and the long, slow work of becoming a people rather than simply an assembly of people. But 40 years begins somewhere, and it begins here, on the far shore of the sea, with the morning light on the water and the bodies and hearts of the people still reverberating from the night they had just lived through. Everything began with a step. The first step onto the path through the sea, in the dark, with the water on either side. The first step onto the far shore. The first step away from the shore and into the wilderness, toward the long road. Every long journey begins this way, with a single step taken in a particular direction, and then another, until the accumulation of steps becomes a journey, and the journey becomes a story, and the story becomes part of the memory of the world. The people took their steps. The wilderness received them. The pillar went before them. Tonight, from a very great distance in time, we rest beside their story. The sea is quiet. The shore is still. The morning on the far side of the crossing is long past, in the way that mornings 3,000 years ago are long past. Not gone exactly, but settled into the deep layer of history that holds such things, still real, still present in the memory that has carried them, still capable of being inhabited with the imagination and the heart in the quiet hours of a night very different from that night and yet not entirely unlike it. We are all, in some sense, in the middle of crossings, in the middle of long journeys whose ends we cannot yet see, in the middle of wilderness passages that are slower and more demanding than we expected, between the shore we left and the shore we are moving toward. The story of the crossing is not only a story about what happened once. It is a story that has been carried by people across all the centuries since, because it speaks to something that does not change. The experience of being between, of being afraid, of seeing something that looks impossible, and of discovering that there is a way through. Not always the way we expected, not always on the timeline we hoped for, but a way. The pillar of cloud and fire that had stood between the Israelites and the Egyptians through the night had done its work. And when the people moved, it moved with them. This is one of the quieter continuities of the Exodus story. The fact that the presence that guided them did not complete one task and then depart. The pillar that had been their guide from the very beginning of their journey continued to go before them, day after day in the form of cloud, night after night in the form of fire. In the dry and largely featureless terrain of the Sinai Peninsula, this continuity of guidance mattered enormously. The wilderness can disorient even those who know it well. For a people who had never traveled it, who had no experience of its patterns or landmarks, who were navigating by instinct and faith rather than by maps, the pillar was not a small thing. It told them when to move and when to stop. The ancient accounts of the wilderness journey, developed further in the book of Numbers, describe how the people watched the cloud. When it lifted, they traveled. When it settled, they camped. The rhythm of their days was organized around this signal, this visible presence, this cloud that moved and rested according to a purpose they could follow, even when they could not fully understand it. There is something very simple and very restful in this image. A people watching for the cloud, waiting for it to move, moving when it moves, stopping when it stops, not racing ahead of it, not lagging too far behind, simply following at the pace the cloud sets, through terrain that cannot be navigated any other way. This is not a sophisticated spiritual practice. It does not require learning or particular ability. It requires only attention, the willingness to keep watching, to notice when the cloud lifts, to be ready to move when the signal comes, and to rest when the cloud settles. The people were learning this in the years of the wilderness, slowly, imperfectly, with many stumbles and complaints and wrong turns, but learning it nonetheless. The cloud went before them. They followed. The days passed. The seasons turned. The wilderness, which had seemed so impossible from the shores of Egypt, was crossed, mile by patient mile. The sea returned to itself. This is a detail worth resting beside gently. The sea did not remain divided. It did not stay as a monument to what had occurred, a permanent reminder, a landmark that travelers could point to and say, "Here is where the path was." The water came back. The sea resumed its ordinary depth and movement, as though nothing had passed through it. There is no physical trace in the landscape of the ancient world of the crossing. The sea has been for 3,000 years and more, simply the sea, wide and deep and indifferent and beautiful in its own way. The memory of the crossing lives not in the landscape, but in the people. It was carried in the telling, from parent to child and child to grandchild, across all the generations from that morning to this night. It was carried in the flat, unleavened bread, in the night of watching, in the annual return to the story that became part of the rhythm of the year. The sea remembered nothing, perhaps. The sea does not remember, but the people remembered. And in their remembering, the crossing has remained real, present in the consciousness of those who carry it as surely as the morning of it was present to those who stood on the far shore. Memory is one of the quieter gifts. It does not require permanence of the physical kind, stone monuments or inscribed tablets, or the enduring structures of built civilization. It requires only people who pay attention and tell what they have seen and pass the telling on. The people of Israel were people of memory. They told their stories. They told them carefully, in specific ways, with specific words, at specific times of year, so that the telling itself would become a kind of vessel for the thing being told, so that the story would not wear away in the passing of generations, but would remain sharp and present and alive in the mouths of those who told it and the hearts of those who heard. The crossing of the sea has been told in this way for more than 3,000 years. It is being told tonight, in the quiet of this hour, to whoever is listening. The sea returned to itself. The memory remained. Let the story settle now, as a calm water settles. The morning on the far shore is still in the mind's eye. The light on the sea, the people breathing, the animals quiet, the children sleeping, the wilderness stretching ahead, vast and open and possible, the pillar still present, still going before. Let the water be what it is, the sea that divided and became a path and returned, vast and old and quiet, moving with its own steady rhythm against whatever shore lies closest to wherever you are tonight. The sound of water, which is one of the oldest sounds in the world, which has been heard by every generation of people who have ever lived beside it, which is the same tonight as it was on the morning of the crossing 3,000 years ago. Let Moses be where he is in the story, standing on the far shore with his staff in his hand, having done what he was asked to do, having stretched his hand over the sea when the time came, having spoken to the people in their fear and told them to be still, tired perhaps, full of something too large to name, looking at the sea now quiet, and at the people now resting, and at the road ahead that would be long. He had been told at the burning bush that he would not walk it alone. The evidence of the night just past was substantial. He had walked through the sea with the people he was leading. He had led from within their midst, not from a distance, not from a position of safety. He had been on the path when the water was on either side. He had been with them. Let the fear that came at the shore be what it was, real, human, entirely understandable. The kind of fear that comes when circumstances become genuinely difficult, when what was hoped for does not look like what is actually present. The fear that says, perhaps this was a mistake. Perhaps the familiar difficulty was preferable to this unknown one. And let the instruction that came within the fear be what it was. Not dismissive, not demanding, not impatient with the human heart that cannot always simply choose not to be afraid. Be still, watch. The Lord will fight for you. Let these words be present tonight, in whatever way they can be present, not as demands, not as instructions for action, simply as words that were spoken once on a shore beside a sea, to people who were afraid, and who listened, and who walked through the water when the water divided, and who stood on the far shore in the morning and breathed. Let the breath slow now. Let the body rest where it is. Let whatever is being carried today settle gently downward, the way the eastern wind settles when the purpose that drove it has been fulfilled. The crossing is complete. The sea is quiet. The shore holds the morning light. The people rest. The pillar has settled for the night, still present, still luminous in its own quiet way, but at rest. Not driving, not leading, simply there. The way a guardian presence is there in the night, not constantly active, but continuous, watching, present. You are on a shore tonight, in your own way. What lies behind you is behind you. What lies ahead will be met when it is time to meet it. Tonight there is only this, the rest that comes after the crossing. The quiet that is not emptiness, but fullness of a different kind. The sea that divided is at peace. The path is closed because it has already been walked. The far shore is where you are. Rest now. The watching continues. The presence does not sleep, does not turn away, does not leave the shore. Breathe in, breathe out. Let the rhythm of it be like water against a shore, steady, patient, neither hurrying nor waiting, simply present. The story is old and true and full. It has been carried across 3,000 years of telling and has arrived here tonight to this quiet hour. Let it rest in you the way old stories rest, not demanding anything, not requiring a response, simply present, a testimony to the fact that ways have been made through impossible things before, and the one who made them has not changed. Be still. The water is quiet. The morning will come. Sleep. Amen.